Bunny by Mona Awad is the most insane fever dream of a book, so let's talk about it. First of all, I know this isn't my normal content, but I just read this book and I wanted to talk about it. I come prepared with notes, so if you enjoyed this video, think about subscribing, and yeah, let's talk about it. So first of all, Bunny is often described as dark academia, feminist and dark comedy, and obviously it is all three of those things, but personally, to me, dark academia, more books like The Secret History, We Were Liars, they've all got that autumny sort of cozy vibe. This book is not that. It is set in an academic setting, sure, it has dark themes, but does it fit in with that like cozy dark academia vibe? Not really. Also, I think it is really important to think about the psychological element of this book, because I have not seen very many people talking about it, but that was one of the main things that hit me the whole way through. Feminist, dark comedy and psychology are how I would describe this book, and the main themes in it are definitely gender, sexuality, wealth inequality, but also psychology, ethics and animal cruelty. So even if those last two are a little bit of a stretch, also important to consider in terms of this book. So if you haven't read Bunny, I'll give you a bit of an introduction and then I'll let you know when I'm about to talk spoilers, so you can stop and read it if you want to. Bunny is the story of Samantha, who is a student doing her master's, I believe, at a really fancy creative writing school called Warren, which, you know, little pun there, Warren's are actually where rabbits live. They're sort of interconnected tunnels, so you know, that's all linked to the theme Bunny. And she's a student there, and the only other people in her class are four girls who are all really sort of cliquey, think sort of Mean Girls, Heathers, that sort of vibe, and she calls them the Bunnies because they call each other Bunny. And they're very wealthy, very feminine, and sort of exclude her from their group. So within this group we have Cupcake, who's Caroline, Creepy Doll, Kira, Vignette, Victoria, and the Duchess, Eleanor. So Samantha and her best friend Ava, spend a lot of time sort of mocking these girls, even though Ava isn't actually in their class, but she feels very isolated from them. And then one day they invite her to hang out with them, and she goes along not knowing what to expect, and she ends up in a bit of an interesting situation. It's a little bit culty, you know, lots of stuff's going on, so I'll leave it there. If you want to go read the book, read the book. Skip this part if you've already read the book. I'll put a timestamp to skip to. Samantha goes to one of the Bunny sessions that she was invited to, and she starts hanging out with them more and more after that, and leaves Ava. So in this session that she goes to, they have a sort of they call it a workshop, and what they do is they make her catch a bunny, like a little rabbit, and then they somehow turn them into men, but they don't call them men, they call them like hybrids or drafts, because they're not like fully formed people. They have no hands, they're often like deeply flawed, so like if you actually try and have a conversation with them, they won't respond, but they're also able to be manipulated by the bunnies. So whoever creates them gives them a name, personality traits, they can say they can speak French, and the bunnies often try and create the like ideal man. So there's all these men who are like, oh yeah, tell me everything about you, but they have to wear gloves because they don't have hands, and they can't actually go outside like the set script or their heads will explode. So she watches as this happens, and then one day they're like, okay, right, Samantha, you've watched us do this enough, it's your turn. So she tries to turn a bunny into a man, but this is just going to be a very surface level explanation, but the bunny hops away and nothing happens. And then a man appears at the door, and he's sort of just described as this like figure wearing a dark trench coat, but we kind of find out that his name is Max. The bunnies basically then kick her out the group because she couldn't turn the bunny, you know, they don't want her anymore. Yeah, so then it's winter break, over winter break, she spends so much time alone. She's isolated herself from Ava, who was until this point her best friend in the entire world, and she's now isolated herself from the bunnies as well. So she's a bit lonely. She's just sat in her house, you know, drinking, looking for food, just sort of bed rotting, you know, until one day she goes out to the shop and she sees Max stealing things in this really fancy shop, and then she's like, oh my god, what's he doing? Follows him out of the shop, and she starts thinking she needs to find Ava. She realizes she needs to follow him because he knows where Ava is, because she's somehow forgotten where Ava lives, and she's not entirely sure about this herself, but she knows she needs to find Ava because then she'll be happier. So she follows Max, and he ends up leading her to Ava's house, and Ava's like, oh my god, I'm so happy to see you, where were you? I thought you were gone with those bunnies. And then introduces her to Max, who she's already seen like as a trench coat figure. She hasn't really seen very much about him, and she's like, this is Max, I'm dating him, he's living in the room upstairs. Samantha moves in with Ava and Max, but then things start to get a bit weird. Samantha starts to realise that Max is eerily familiar. She realises he has all the same favourite things as her, and then she realises he's said some things that she's written in like her personal notebooks, because she's a writer, and he uses exact phrases that she's written down. And then she realises Max is her creation. When she turned the bunny, she turned it into Max, or she turned a different animal into Max. She then keeps an eye on Max, and she's like, I know what you are, you're my bunny, or pretty much. And he's like, okay, I'm still gonna date Ava though. So she ends up snooping through his room, and she finds his phone, and on his phone he's been messaging all the bunnies, and it turns out he's been sleeping with all of them under different names, and sort of like kind of torturing them while sleeping with them. It's a whole thing. But Sam had said to Max, oh, I hate the bunnies, just in passing, and so he's gone and done this to them because he is her creation. I don't know if that makes sense. But she realises this, and while she's snooping through his phone, he walks in and he's like, what are you doing? That's my phone. He's like, oh, sorry, it was an accident, I didn't mean to come into your locked room. And then she runs out his room terrified, and she realises she needs to go and tell Ava. So she goes to Ava and she's like, listen, you won't believe this, but the bunnies turn bunnies into men, and Max is not a real person. And Ava's like, yeah, you're so funny, well done, you've been right, you finally got your creative spirit back. And obviously doesn't believe her, because why would she? Sam then goes to school, and she's like, oh yeah, just going back to school. While she's at school, Ava tells Max to leave her alone, and then Max takes this as not a good thing, and he kills her. Yeah, it's a bit unclear what happens, to be honest, but Ava's dead. Samantha then goes and finds Max, and together they hunt down and hurt the bunnies. I'm realising this sounds terrible, but it's a really good book. And then all the bunnies end up super injured, and it's graduation. So it's Samantha's graduation, and at Samantha's graduation, she's graduating, she sees the bunnies, and then she sees a swan on the river, and she says, I gaze at the swan floating by the bank. Maybe I could do it again. Imagine her back. Live on the roofs and trees in my mind with another her beside me forever. Take her mesh hand in mine, and this time never let go. So, turns out Ava wasn't real. Ava was a swan that she imagined into a person, pretty much. So that's where the psychological theme in here appears. And then she's also talking to this guy who appears a couple times throughout the book. He has a massive thing for Samantha, but she's not really into him. But then on the last page, she kind of agrees to go with him after graduation, because she's got no one else left. Max is gone. He's turned back into a deer. So she's completely alone. And Jonah the guy who has a crush on her, says to her, oh, you can come with me if you want. And she says, I lower my gaze to the mud. Sure, Samantha, says the mud. I'd love to. So is Jonah real, or is she just talking to him while looking down? We don't know. So that's a quick synopsis, which was probably extremely unclear. I hope you enjoyed. You probably want to go read a Wikipedia summary now. But let's talk about what I liked about this book. This is just going to be a brief sort of interesting points that I thought about while reading the book. I have an English literature A level. I'm not very qualified to talk about this. This is just what I found interesting, and I haven't really scripted this out. I've just got bullet points here. So bear with me. And this is also my first time filming a book related video. This is going to need a lot of editing, trust me. I just talked for 10 minutes about that synopsis, which was very unclear, and I'm probably going to have to refilm. But if you have any thoughts, please let me know. Point number 1. From the very first time Samantha meets the bunnies, it's clear that there's some sort of psychological element to this book. So they give her this special drink that's like just for her when she arrives, and she drinks it and she's like, it's really bitter, but they won't let her add any sugar to it, and it will say like she can like feel it weighing her down almost, which obviously it could just be alcohol, but I thought that was really interesting. This guy that she mentions in bunny form, and obviously well, his head ends up exploding, but Samantha at this point doesn't know that he's a bunny and is literally like in shock, and they end up giving her these pills. And so I think that it's really interesting how early that element was sort of introduced, but people don't really talk about that. And I think even from then I was like, even from when she had the drink, I was like, are they drugging her? Like, is she being drugged? What's happening here? And then another thing I thought was quite interesting, like at a similar point in the book, but maybe it was mentioned, but I'm not entirely sure that it was. I was like, wait, where are her parents? Because obviously she's a uni student, but it does not mention her family at all until like 250 pages in. It doesn't mention where her family are. So I'm like, I wanted to know more about the backstory of this character, and actually there's a sequel coming out in September, which I didn't realise when I read it, but I'm very excited for now. That was something I wanted to know more about. And then one bit that I absolutely loved was the characterisation of the bunnies. So throughout, we have these two sort of different versions of the bunnies almost, at different points throughout. So we have three pretty much actually. First of all, we have their nicknames, which are all like very superficial. They put on them when she like labelled them when she wasn't a part of the group herself, which are like Cupcake, Creepy Doll, Vignette, the Duchess. And then we have their actual names, which we don't actually hear very often in the book. So for the first like third of the book, I would say it's just their nicknames that she's assigned to them, but no one else knows. You only get their actual names nearer the end when she knows them a lot better, but has sort of distanced herself from them. And then that bit in the middle is what I thought was amazingly written. They all call each other Bunny. So within the group, they will just say, oh, your dress looks so cute, Bunny. Thank you so much, Bunny. And they all just refer to each other as Bunny. But I thought it was really interesting when Samantha became one of the bunnies, the way she would not only react to Bunny and not her name when people came and tried to find her, but also the way that she sort of had that hive mind mentality with them, even when she didn't quite realise it. She was saying things like, oh yeah, I heard this sentence come out of one of our mouths, and describing all the bunnies collectively as like a blob. I thought that was really, really interesting. I really liked how that was written. There are two main ways people interpret this book, in a more literal way or a less literal way. So the more literal way is when people think that Ava herself is a hybrid. Hybrids actually exist. Ava is one, and she's from a swan, and the bunny sort of recruited her because she could already make hybrids and they were interested in that. But I personally didn't see it in that way. I saw it in more a less literal way. Ava is not real, I would say. She's more an imagined character that Samantha has come up with. So whether it's difficult to say whether the hybrids were real or not, because some people see it as it's purely a metaphor, and the hybrid, like the bunnies coming up with the hybrids, or like creating the hybrids, are actually them just creating characters, because obviously they're in a writing school. But then obviously it's like, it's a spectrum. Like there's the completely non-literal, it's just them coming up with the writing school, and Samantha herself has schizophrenia, and she's the only one who's seeing anything like this. Then there's the middle, which is sort of where I sit personally, where the hybrids and things are actually happening, but Ava isn't one of them, and some elements of it are still Samantha's own schizophrenia. And then there's the literal version where Ava is a hybrid. Some things I wasn't sure about myself is Jonah. He really threw me off, because throughout the whole book I thought it was really interesting, his character was really interesting, because he doesn't really appear fictional in lots of the ways the other ones does, because he has all these problems himself, but obviously the way that he brings up his problems consistently over and over again, almost every time we meet him, is a little abnormal. And with the last sentence at the end being very up to interpretation, it's difficult to say whether he was also mud or whether she's literally just looking at the floor while speaking to him. Whereas with Ava, it's a lot more obvious that she sort of wasn't actually there. Una was a big sort of question mark for me. I also found it really interesting the way she distanced from Ava throughout the middle of the book, because obviously if we go with the interpretation that Ava is either a hybrid or a part of her imagination and is not a physical real person, which I think we can assume from the lines at the end of the book, then the distance from Ava is something that we can look at as sort of distance from herself almost, which I thought was really interesting. It's almost as she becomes more intertwined with the bunnies, she loses herself, and whether or not even the bunnies were actually real, or whether they were also a part of her sort of almost hallucinations, is also really interesting to think about, because the way that they just represent a complete stereotype was really interesting, and obviously could just be a tool that Mona Awad's using, or again could be another one of her hallucinations. So I think the fact that she sort of loses herself when she's with the bunnies is really interesting, and it also sort of portrays that cultish hive mind, and I love the way that we experience it with her, as she's calling each other bunnies, and also just that use of we and are consistently is so amazingly done. I think that was my favourite thing about the book. Some other points. Another character I really wasn't sure about is the lion, because he doesn't have a very big part in the story, but he obviously has a big part in Samantha's backstory, so hopefully we get more information on him, please, because she does consistently say throughout that she has not slept with him. That's the main thing we know about him. In fact, like, that's pretty much the only thing we know about him, other than the fact he's a professor. I don't even know his name, so I think the way, I want to know more about him, because we got nothing pretty much. Other quick things, I loved her critique on performative art, and her critique on sort of the shallow feminism that the bunnies embody. So throughout there's lots of, mentions, it's an art school, there's lots of mentions of performative art, especially at the end when there's like a janitor who has to clear up like ribbons and feathers. Again, not entirely sure whether this was real or her hallucination, not entirely sure whether the attack scene before it was real or her hallucination, but critique on performative art was really interesting, I thought. And also the way that Samantha critiques the bunnies writing for lots of the same things that actually happen in this book, so it sort of again brings you as a reader into the book. So she critiques them for almost she critiques them for using fairy tales, which this book has lots of Alice in Wonderland like vibes, references. Critiques them for being too descriptive and just adding shocking elements just to shock. So yeah, I think it's really interesting that lots of that actually happens in the book while she's critiquing them about it. You're also even more brought into it. This quote on the cover from Margaret Atwood: "Oh Bunny, you are so genius." I think the way she calls Mona Awad Bunny is really interesting, because it's sort of, again, it's just bringing the bunnies into the real world, and you can fully reflect on it. You become a part of the world in the book, which is definitely my favourite thing. There's another theory that pretty much the whole story is Samantha's hallucination. So there's the idea that Samantha is in a mental institution. This is backed up by the fact she mentions her like perverted neighbour who's always naked and who is a little strange, but then we also have all the bunnies, and so lots of people think that with the references to pills as well. And I think there's a point where she describes her windows as having bars on, so everything throughout that has made some people think that she could be institutionalized for the entirety of the book, and I think that's another really interesting take. Again, there's lots of different ways to interpret this book. One final thing I wanted to talk about was the fact that I would love to see this as a film, because I think it would make such a great film. The way, don't get me wrong, I loved it as a book, and I think it would probably be better as a book, but I would also love to see it as a film, because I think it would just make the most amazing sort of trippy film, and I think it would widen the appeal of the book and the story, which obviously lots of people have read, but you know, not everyone reads. You know, if you have not read this book, I would definitely recommend it. Even if I said a lot about it, I still think it's worth a read. And this is not my normal content, but I hope you enjoy, and if you did, please subscribe. So yeah, I had a lot to say about this book, but I hope you enjoyed it.